Have you considered the possibility that in our lifetimes, the Middle East, the birthplace of Christianity, could be devoid of Christians? It could, and sooner than you think. I'm Sheila Lagminas. Time for a closer look. Welcome to the program. Thanks for tuning in. In fact, Pope Francis just said recently to the head of the Knights of Columbus, the Supreme Knight, Carl Anderson, before they made another visit to the Middle East, to the Nineveh Plains in Iraq, Pope Francis said, the Middle East without Christians is not the Middle East. Well, it's also very possible, and he knows that, which is why groups like the Knights of Columbus and those members of Congress who've worked together with the Knights, especially in producing the report they came out with a few years ago, proving that genocide was truly happening in the Middle East to Christians and who are also being persecuted and just wiped out, and other religious minorities. That's why when that report came out, it brought, by the hands of a couple of members of Congress who wrote the genocide resolution, it brought about a vote in the House of Representatives that got, it could have been first time this happened. I don't know. Historically, I don't remember if this was, but it was first time in a very long time. It got a unanimous vote. Unanimous. Every member of the House of Representatives voted to call what was happening genocide. Well, what did that do? Right away, those of us who were very involved in this, reporting on it, airing, people from Congress who were coming on the air. I attended a UN conference, New York, at the United Nations on persecution and mass genocide against Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. And all of these people were there, the Supreme Knight Carl Anderson and a young Yazidi woman, and many people, those involved in religious liberty around the world, Dr. Tom Farr, so many significant voices up there speaking on the panel in front of the United Nations. We were there. I interviewed the Archbishop of Aleppo, Archbishop Jean Bart, and he told me specifically what his people in Aleppo, Syria, wanted him to say in New York first of all, to the Western world and to us in America, when he was there and able to tell us everything that they were suffering through and everything they were really hoping that we would do for them once we became more aware. Well, we're aware. And then what happened after that was Carl Anderson held up that report that the Knights of Columbus produced to prove genocide was happening. So we were hoping something would happen pretty quickly. The then Secretary of State John Kerry did declare, yes, it's genocide. What happened after that? And is it still going on to that degree? I'm really happy to say joining me now is the author of that bill at that time, who stays on this more than anybody I know, Nebraska Congressman Jeff Fortenberry. He's a member of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, and also he's the co-chair of the Religious Minorities in the Middle East Caucus. He's on top of this Nineveh Plain Province resolution and other resolutions like it all the time. Visited the region not long ago. Congressman, welcome back, and thank you. Welcome back to the program and to the United States. It's been too long since we've talked.
Sheila, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for requesting that I come back on, and thanks for, first of all, who you are and what you do, and for your interest in this issue of the persecution of religious minorities. And I'm sorry if I'm a little bit late. I just ran from a TV interview, and I wanted to thank them on television as well, because we talked about the same thing. And we have to keep talking about this, and sometimes I worry there's not enough interest in it, but really ultimately this is about the protection of human dignity, which is this idea that each person has a sacred space, and that sacred space of conscience and making rightful choice as it expresses itself in religious liberty is the basis for civilization itself. And if you can't find the space to be able to exercise your reasoned, faith-filled ideals in a society about love of self, love of neighbor, being responsible to community, then there's no chance for civilization. So one of the reasons that we introduced the security resolution for northern Iraq to integrate Christians and Yazidis into the Iraqi security forces is simply this prospect of potentially trying to restore what once was a rich religious pluralism that existed in northern Iraq as well as Baghdad, where Christians numbered over 1 million. They're now down to 200,000. The Yazidis, an ancient religious sect that's not Muslim, not Christian, they have their own sets of beliefs, but lived in peaceful harmony, have been persecuted through the centuries. But after ISIS tried to exterminate both Christians and Yazidis in certain Muslim minority communities, this word genocide, we were able to pass the genocide resolution that actually called it what it was. And the attempt there was to elevate international consciousness about what was happening to this, again, these ancient faith traditions. But we got to take it a step further. We've shifted a lot of aid there, but that aid is not sustainable unless there's a new security footprint.
What would that security footprint look like? I know how listeners right now are hearing that and wondering what that would mean. I'm very curious, Congressman, and you know how much I've followed this over the years, but as things change and morph and transition and so forth, and now Baghdadi is back on the airwaves, or at least online. He's got videos out, and one wonders how long that's going to go on. But what would a footprint look like over there?
Well, I'm glad you raised the issue of Baghdadi, and let me take both of those points. ISIS is defeated, but they are not gone. And the circumstances in northern Iraq, the environment is such that would allow them to potentially regenerate. I was there. I was on the ground. The vice president actually asked that I go and evaluate the situation, and that's one of the findings. But the reality of the security resolution itself is the takeaway from that visit. We are shifting tens of millions of dollars in aid to the religious minority communities to help them rebuild, which is extremely important. And that aid, it is creating possibilities, but there is an urgency to the circumstances. But without security, then none of it will work. The aid is not sustainable, and we'll lose these populations forever to out-migration. And then northern Iraq, again, there will be a diversion to tribal and ethnic allegiance. Iraq as a country will never have healthy nationalism around this principle of pluralism and respect. And then it'll just potentially never have peace. So the security resolution specifically calls for the integration of Christians and Yazidis and other religious minorities into the Iraqi security forces during an international training mission that is centered on counterterrorism, so that ISIS can never regenerate and never happen again. Remember, the reason that this happened is that the Kurdish Peshmerga troops collapsed in the wake of ISIS. The Iraqi security forces collapsed in the wake of ISIS. The Christians and Yazidis are completely vulnerable and exposed, and they were murdered. They were slaughtered, and those left had to flee. And there's 400,000 Yazidis in refugee camps, by the way. And as of when I was in Iraq, the last count that we had, and who knows what the statistic is now, 3,500 Yazidi women still held as slaves, sex slaves, by ISIS. So, look, I get it, Sheila. As you just said, America has given so much, and we've lost so much in Iraq. It's hard to understand why we should do anything else, and yet there is one more thing we must do. This in its nature would be international. It wouldn't be necessarily led by the United States. We would be a co-partner with other international training missions to help the Iraqi central government better integrate the religious minorities in their central forces with some degree of autonomy, authority to protect themselves, particularly in the north. Or else ISIS could regenerate. Iran is already funding militias in the area there, and they have intentions and designs. There will be pressure for out-migration, and you'll lose forever the ancient religious minority communities. That's what's at stake here, and that's why I've done this.
And that's why I opened the program asking every one of our listeners across the country right now, have you considered the possibility that in our lifetimes, the Middle East, the birthplace of Christianity, could be devoid of Christians? And it could actually, and sooner than you think. Congressman, it seems like it wasn't all that many years ago that then Princeton Professor Robert George, then the USCIRF chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Liberty, which, by the way, we can get to that in a moment, just released yesterday, I think, excuse me, a new report on international religious liberty, where it stands right now. And these things, some of these things are in there, the persecution and the mass murder of large populations. But when Prince Professor Robert George was the chair of USCIRF, he came on the show and talked about this very thing, how far or soon down the road it could be that there would not be Christians. There's such a small population now. We have to not only preserve and protect that, but you, Congressman Fortenberry, are a great champion not only of protecting and preserving, but building back up again, not finding them homes in other places, but actually helping them keep the home they have there and build it up there.
Great point. That is exactly the point. When this first started to happen, all the pressure for policy in Washington was out-migration, helping people out-migrate, and there is a place for that. But the real response of the responsible international community ought to help people when they are in some beleaguered circumstances, when they are under real threat, to be proximate to where they came from with some sustainable aid, and then us work on the conditions that will allow them to return. Imagine yourself with your rootedness, with your family here in America, being forced out by some twisted, dark ideology, forced into another country, and you're just told, well, that's your life. Good luck. Who would want to do that? Our response to humanitarian crisis ought to be able to try to help people temporarily in need, keep them proximate to where they came from, and when possible, help them to return. Except in the hardest cases, then that calls for the migration. We had the whole order reversed. And by the way, a lot of the Catholic architecture out there has this reversed. We need to build up the conditions in countries, the responsible nations of the world, including America and others. And by the way, I pressed the Secretary of State the other day on just how much aid our friends the Chinese give in humanitarian relief worldwide. He didn't have a number. It was a rhetorical question. And I pretty much said it's probably zero. We give about $25 billion of American taxpayer money all around the world to try to pursue this principal goal of justice, and we get very little gratitude in return. But the justice issue first is to try to help people remain where they are or return. And part of the security resolution is a response to that. Without security, people cannot go back. Would you? I wouldn't.
No.
If you have a family to protect, how could you? The Yazidis want to go back to Sinjar where they came from, and yet it's dangerous. But all through, when you were asking me the question a moment ago, I'm sorry to divert to so many things. I couldn't help but think of it. I couldn't help but think of the first image that I saw when I was in Iraq. I went to the little town of Teleskov. There was a young priest there who came from Rome, led 20 young Catholics back to that village to start to rebuild. The very first thing I saw in northern Iraq was a statue of the Blessed Mother in their courtyard. I mean, what a beautiful, magnificent, powerful image of hope, and a priest and young people risking their lives. 5 minutes away is another Christian village that they couldn't even go to because it was militia controlled. They can't even go there. But they're there risking their lives, and I think it's incumbent upon us and the Europeans and other good people of goodwill around the world to help restore these people's right to their ancient homeland. And what's at stake is not just justice for them, it's the principle of civilization itself. But I get it. I understand. I'm exhausted by Iraq. So is America. This is one last thing we ought to do. It's about possibility, but it's urgent, and it depends upon security.
You know, Congressman Fortenberry, I really think that our listeners coast to coast aren't thinking exactly. I just have outrage fatigue, or I have crisis fatigue. They may about many other issues that are so divisive and so ugly and polarized and so forth, but not this. Because when we talk about things like this, it always just warms my heart so much to get the emails I get and things I post on the Facebook show page, the comments under that I get, and to see the shares that people are sharing that through their social media networks so other people will be aware, because they do want to know this, and they're not hearing it elsewhere for the most part. You turn on news cycles right now, any channel almost, and what you're going to see are different sound bites or different interviews about ongoing investigations left and right, and you're going to see the 2020 presidential election, back and forth, and all of that. But you aren't going to see this, and you aren't going to hear about this very often at all, except from you. To your point about the ancient homelands, the ethnic minorities, keeping them there, helping build up. And the passion, I love your passion. You've always had that. That's what it's going to take. I beat that drum as well. I have it in my heart. Before you came on, I was telling quickly listeners about being out front of the United Nations after the 3-day conference I attended there. And on the sidewalk, Archbishop Jean Bart of Aleppo, I got a quick interview with him, and how happy he was to be able to tell me and the listeners about his people and what they want told to those in the West, so that they, back in Syria, could be helped by us once we knew. And so we wanted to be able to tell him, yes, tell your people we're doing something about this. So to your point about this, Congressman Fortenberry, you're the sponsor of House Resolution 259. The number doesn't matter to people, but what it's called is. It expresses the House of Representatives' sense of support, wanting to support the repatriation of religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq to their ancestral homelands. Please give us an update on that.
Well, first of all, if you don't mind, I'm going to respond to something else that you said first.
Absolutely.
I know Archbishop Jean-Bert. I met him. He sought a meeting with me, and I thought he was just going to give us, as the American Congress members, an earful, particularly given what he faced in Aleppo and in Syria. This was a humble man, almost with tears in his eyes. He was explaining to us how under siege they were from all sides, how they have to try to coexist in a very entangled, difficult set of circumstances, where if they have a democratic system, if you will, the result could be for them death. So that they have to live with certain dilemmas in the midst of just trying to survive and hang on to their ancient faith tradition, not wanting to be proximate to those who commit injustice, but also trying to survive as minorities. And it was such a heartfelt, humbling experience for me to be around that man whose church has suffered severe persecution, death, and destruction, and yet he stays, and he speaks to us from the heart. At the end, I told him that we were with him, and he said, "Do you speak for the Americans?" And perhaps this is impolitic, and perhaps it was an overuse of the limited authority I have, but I said, "Yes, I do." Because I think most people in America, and hearing his story about how they're just trying to survive and hang on to that little remnant of their faith tradition in a very complicated situation, would be moving to most Americans. But to your point about security resolution, it's bipartisan resolution, which I'm very proud of. By the way, when we got the genocide designation earlier, that was a unanimous vote in the Congress. I mean, we don't agree on anything. We don't agree on Mother's Day. So having a unanimous vote was very important. I don't know if we'll get there on this. This is more complicated, but it is concrete action that is actually doable. So if the Congress of the United States lays down a marker and says it is important for Christians and Yazidis, for the Iraqi government to integrate them into their central government forces under the Iraqi flag, with a little bit of help from America, with a little bit of help from the Europeans and other countries of goodwill. There were 74 coalition partners, by the way, in Iraq, backing up the Iraqi army, who did a great job defeating ISIS, by the way, on the battlefield. But if we would just give them a little bit of support, put these training missions, counterterrorism missions, embedded in northern Iraq, in Nineveh and Sinjar primarily, it will give confidence. It will create security infrastructure. It will allow people trapped in Kurdistan, trapped in refugee camps, to go home and rebuild. And Iraq will have a chance for healthy pluralism, respect, and tolerance. That's what I call nationalism in its best sense, a healthy nationalism. And we will be proud, I think, that maybe the end of all that we've suffered in Iraq has been something virtuous and good.
And that's what people want. That's why I don't think when they hear you talk about a security footprint that anybody's cringing or anybody's saying, I'm so fatigued by crises. They're probably very energized by this, and hearing you, Congressman Fortenberry, talk about our need to help our brothers and sisters in Iraq, in the Middle East, and other places. When you say 400,000 Yazidis are in refugee camps, and I don't know if you have a count on the Christians, but the Christians, I know I heard at the UN conference from Father Douglas Bazzi in Erbil, and he was talking about how the Christians were afraid to go into the refugee camps because they were run by the UN, but they were largely Muslim refugees in there, and the Christians weren't safe in there. They didn't feel safe in there, so they pitched tents next to their parish church, next to Father Bazzi's church, their church, and they felt safer outside their own Christian church than they did in a refugee camp. I can't understand how that can happen, and we can't do something about it to that point. What can you tell us about Vice President Pence in the past talking about the Genocide Recovery and Persecution Response Program, redirecting funds instead of through the United Nations, where they were largely going to those very camps themselves, and more towards, say, Knights of Columbus, Samaritan's Purse, and others, where it could go directly to those most in need?
Well, I'm completely in solidarity with the Vice President. In fact, when he gave that speech, I was standing right behind him, and I had to speak after him, which is not a good position to be in, because when he offered the opportunity for us to pursue a shift of funding from multilateral agencies. who, by the way, are good at certain things. The UN does a good job with peacekeeping forces and certain large infrastructure projects. But being sensitive to the faith traditions of Christians and just expecting them to show up in circumstances that are not safe for them wouldn't even be in the consciousness of the United Nations generally. So a shift of aid was appropriate directly to these communities through non-governmental organizations who are also in solidarity with them. Now, the reason I went to Iraq at the Vice President's behest was to evaluate the circumstances there. And as I walked away, there's just 3 words that summarize it. It's possible this aid can actually create the conditions in which people can return. It is urgent. If we don't do this now, it will be forever lost. But it all depends upon security. People will not go back home. This aid is not sustainable if it isn't secure. So the simple idea is not to create another whole international force structure to go in and occupy the place. It is to integrate indigenous peoples who ever have a right to be there as much as anyone else, this is their ancient homeland, into their own security forces under the Iraqi flag with some degree of autonomy to protect themselves. That's what happened the last time. By the way, one of my interns in the office, she's gone on to college. She came to America without even being able to speak English. She's a Yazidi, and I represent the largest Yazidi community in America. Right. It's in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's odd, interesting convergence of things. Extraordinary community who proudly waves the American flag and yet clings to their ancient tradition and teaches us about it as well. She wrote me a beautiful letter, and there was some earlier problems with grammar, but it was so heartfelt. I said, let's give her an internship. She graduated, gave the commencement address at her high school, and now went on to Creighton University, a Jesuit institution, by the way. And the Jesuits, by the way, used to run Baghdad University, and that was taken over by Saddam Hussein. But there's tremendous potentiality, again, here to restore this fundamental principle of pluralism and tolerance and respect for various religious traditions. If that's lost, and it could be lost very soon, and it depends upon a new security idea, and this is a pretty simple one, then Iraq will never be the same. And it's forever lost. It cannot return. So that's why I'm aggressively pursuing this. It is bipartisan. Again, my very good friend Anna Ashew is a Democrat from California she's Chaldean by ethnicity, is a co-sponsor, and we really hope that this will catch on and be very apparent to people, and again help the United States Congress lay down a marker saying this is important. And by the way, that village that I entered, Teleskov, we had a Navy SEAL killed there. He was a part of the backup forces that were training Iraqis. They were in the front. They were in the lead. The Iraqis fought very bravely, and one of our SEALs was killed on the main road right there that we entered town. The other thing that I wanted to make note is when we entered town, there was a big sign on one of the walls, and it said, "Hungary helps." The Hungarians are there doing international relief as well. I think there is a hunger across the world for some type of united effort to actually help these persecuted peoples who are the victims of genocide. And I think my idea is the right one. I just hope Congress will give its assent sometime soon.
So my understanding, before I let you go, Congressman, is that here at the end of March, just recently, it was referred to the House. We don't understand the inner workings. A lot of people don't of the House and the Senate, but it was referred to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. What happens now?
I'll give you the political science textbook answer, then I'll give you the real answer. The academic answer is the House Committee will put it on its possible agenda, and there'll be a decision about a hearing, and then it'll be referred to the whole House as a vote. Unless I am in the face constantly of the chairman, unless I am telling people, just like I'm telling you right now, members of Congress, most of whom when they hear the story are sympathetic, to sign up, this won't happen. I have a lot of personal work to do in this regard, and it's just going to be Congress member by Congress member, in order to sensitize them to the need to do this. That creates the political space by which foreign affairs would be empowered, let's say, to actually take this under consideration. So by you giving me 20 minutes or so here to talk about it, if people listening believe in what I'm saying, have them contact their Congress member, please. I need the help. This doesn't happen by magic. It happens by hard work. Ideas don't matter around here. What matters is the convergence of the idea with the process and the politics, and you create the politics. You create the possibility for a Congress member to prioritize this in the midst of all the other things they have to do.
And did you hear that, folks? That's you. That's what you can do. Congressman Jeff Fortenberry just gave you an action item. That is to call your members of Congress. I'll give you more information. I'll post it on the show page. I'll make sure you know what it is. We need to help Congressman Fortenberry, who has to make this case every day in Congress for the resolution that he's trying to get to help the people in the Middle East who are so persecuted and relying on us. Congressman Fortenberry, God bless you. Thank you so much.